Are you aware of the physical condition of your children?
No. No. I've chosen to trust my wife with the children.
One of the central figures in the Ruby Franke child abuse scandal is her estranged husband, Kevin Franke. He was featured quite prominently in the recently released audio and videotapes, but the question is not only what to make of what he said, but what happens next for him. That's why we're bringing back on Emmy Award-winning reporter Shelby Lofton from KSL-TV out of Utah. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. As we continue to cover the revelations from the Ruby Franke evidence release from this past Friday, we are still trying to assess her husband, Kevin Franke's role in all of this. And more importantly, what is next for him? So as we know, Ruby and Kevin, they had started the 8 Passengers YouTube channel back in the day, documented their lives alongside their 6 kids. This was years before Franke and her business partner, or alleged business partner in this life coaching services organization known as Connections, Jody Hildebrandt, the both of them were ultimately arrested, charged, and pled guilty to aggravated child abuse of 2 of Franke's youngest children, each woman serving 4 consecutive terms of imprisonment that by Utah law could range between 4 to 30 years. It's really up to the Board of Pardons and Paroles that will ultimately determine their respective releases. But during the course of this story, and more recently through the newly released interviews that Ivan's police conducted with Kevin after his wife's arrest, we have learned a lot more about Kevin's dynamic with both Ruby and Jody. And specifically that Kevin agreed to be part of this Connections programs and participated in men's groups and therapy under Jody's instruction to strengthen his marriage with Ruby, even though he was skeptical at first, at least according to him. And we learned that according to Kevin, Ruby and Jody grew closer. Jody isolated Kevin. Ruby ended up asking to separate from Kevin, and, that he hadn't seen his kids in a year. And ultimately, when Ruby was arrested, he had no idea what was happening with this abuse. People have had a lot of questions about Kevin Franke and all of this, and I imagine that conversation is going to continue today after the release of all of these videos and audios. And the question now is, what happens next for him? Well, to discuss this, let me bring back on Emmy Award-winning journalist Shelby Lofton of KSL-TV out in Utah. She's been following the case closely. Shelby, thank you so much for coming on. The last time we had you on, we were doing a preview of what to expect. Now everything has been released. Since we haven't had a chance to talk about it, just overall, what are your thoughts about everything we saw on Friday?
That was quite a bit of evidence. Speaking to the Washington County Attorney's Office the day before, I had an idea of what would be released, but excuse me, going through it from 5 o'clock in the morning local time when it was released here in Utah, it was quite a lot to digest, to sift through, and frankly, hard to stomach at times.
Yeah, and we did a sidebar on this. And we didn't show any of the injuries that were sustained by the children, but watching it was and seeing those injuries was something that's now burned into my memory. And again, I say this before, I said again, it's a lot worse than you could possibly imagine. I do want to talk about Kevin though, and a lot to talk about with Kevin. So first, he does this interview with police on the day of Ruby's arrest. And he says some very interesting things. Like he talks about how he hasn't seen Ruby and the kids and had no idea what was going on.
So are they all living with you, or?
No, I haven't seen them for over a year.
Any of them?
No, none of them.
For a year?
Over a year.
Okay.
I've been in a separation.
From who?
From my wife and family. I don't know anything that's been going on.
Like, this is good, man. Like, I would love to be able to help you out with this, and like, I'm seeing the light of being professional because I'm unaware of your involvement in what's really going on. So for you to say that you're unaware of the status of your kids kind of makes, I know that sounds kind of crummy to you, but it sounds kind of good to me. Have you communicated with your wife regarding like discipline with your kids or their care or their physical well-being?
No.
We kind of knew this already, right, from the statements of his attorney, Randy Kester, but it is very different hearing from Kevin Franke himself.
It is very different. This is the first time we have heard from him. We've only spoken through his attorney. He's chosen not to comment when we've seen him outside of different court hearings. And you can even hear the detectives who are asking him questions are in disbelief. What do you mean you haven't seen your children for over a year? What do you mean you don't know what condition, what state your children are in? It's interesting. And he also is a bit guarded, as one would be when they're talking to police, but he doesn't want to name the person who called him and said to come pick up the kids. He keeps insisting that he's just there to pick up his children and he didn't expect to be sitting down and being interviewed by officers. We now know Ruby Franke had called him and said, go pick up the children. But it's interesting to see the mindset he was in that day. And then later on, the interview was a 180, that second interview with officers.
Hey, I just want to step away from the Franke story for a quick second to highlight something for you guys. Look, I think it's clear from the stories that we cover that the world is a scary place. It is. It's unpredictable. And one of the most traumatic things can be is if you get injured. It happens out of nowhere. What do? Who do you turn to? That is why I want to call out our incredible sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm. They can help. You see, if you're injured, you need to know your legal rights and whether you could be compensated for your injury. And the thing with Morgan & Morgan is they will fight for what you deserve, even if that means having to go to trial. They don't settle for lowball offers from insurance companies. In fact, they've recently won verdicts of $6.8 million in New York, $12 million in Florida, and $26 million in Philadelphia. These verdicts, by the way, all higher than the highest insurance offers in these cases. If you're going to take on big insurance companies, you need a big firm. And one of the best things about Morgan & Morgan is how they've made it so easy for their clients. They've completely modernized the process. From submitting your claim to talking to your legal team, it can all be done on your smartphone. That's it. So if you're injured, you can start by easily submitting a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar or by dialing #law. That's #529 on your phone. But he was almost defending Ruby and Jody.
Do you know a female named Jody?
She is a therapist and a life coach, and she's.
Do you respect her?
Do I respect her? Yeah, I think she's a very honest, truthful person. Yes.
Okay.
Jody saw the need for me to get help, and frankly, I agree. This space has been exactly what I need to face, my own addictions and receive the support and help that I've needed. What's going to happen with my wife? I love my wife.
I don't know. I'm being honest with you. I don't know. Haven't had an interview with
I
her
don't
yet.
have charges against my wife.
Possibly. I think given the circumstances, that's highly appropriate, but again, I don't know your wife. I was hoping to gain some insight from you, but I don't necessarily know that that's something you wanted to,
I trust her,
a road you wanted to travel down with me, so.
and not without legal representation.
Yeah, alright, I get it.
But I love my wife and I trust my wife.
And that seems to be a very different tune from his interview, what is being reported 2 weeks later with investigators.
Around that time, things with Ruby started picking up, and I didn't understand why, but Ruby wanted to meet in a parking lot and wanted me to sign over titles of documents, the two of our cars wanted me to sign them over to her name. And
to Ruby.
Mm-hmm. But I was like, okay, I'm just not. I'm in total compliance mode at this point. Just I'm a good husband. You see, you can trust me, and so whatever she asked, sign over the cars to me, no questions, just okay. And then another thing, she was like, I might want to do an investment, but I will need your signature. Do you trust me enough that I could get your signature if I wanted to pursue my own investment. Yeah, sure. Whatever you say.
How big of an investment was she talking about? Or did she tell you?
She never did, and I never signed anything. She never brought anything to me. But when I returned to the house, everything was packed up, and a neighbor came over and said she asked for the HOA rules and mentioned to him that she wanted to rent the house out, which I was like, are you kidding me? And apparently she wanted to sell the house, but couldn't because my name was on the mortgage. And I think that's what she was talking about, of, will you sign something if I just put it in front of you? And you know what? I probably would have. Like, that's how messed up I was.
I'm glad you didn't.
Me too. That would have been disastrous.
So, Shelby, that's kind of a short summary of what he said later in that audio-only interview, where he also talked about the supernatural elements related to Jodi Hildebrand, kind of like possession and all these things. And he's implicating her. He's even implicating at one point, it seems to be that he's implicating other people as well. And there he was specifically talking about how Ruby was trying to get him to sign over documents and how bizarre it was. Talk to me about what you made of that 180, because that was the thing that I took away more than anything. The 180 that was done both by Ruby and, not going to say Jodi. Jodi's been pretty consistent in what she said in her jailhouse interviews, but the more Ruby and Kevin, like the 180 from defending their actions to, wait a minute, wake up call to what's going on.
It is a 180, truly. And the fact that it was only 2 weeks later that he had this change of heart on Jodi, on his wife, and how their relationship had evolved, it seems rather quick. We know that, speaking through his attorney, Randy Kester, he says that he too was victimized by Jodi. He was in this fog of connections, and he was made to believe that he had problems that he had to sort out and apologize for and sort of repent for. And then 2 weeks later, he explains in great detail to investigators how everything sort of fell apart within his family. And he called Jodi truthful and beautiful in that first interview. And he was so concerned about his wife. And then in that second interview, things were radically different. I think the timeline, a lot of people are going to question. Only 2 weeks later, and you have this realization. It's certainly unexplainable for the rest of us, those of us hearing this audio and watching the interview. It's hard to wrap your mind around someone having such a mindset shift in such a short period of time.
Now, you could argue that people who are awakened from manipulation, they kind of realize what happened, and maybe it can happen over a few months, maybe it can happen over a few days. There could be a change. You kind of see what the reality is. I mean, at the one point in that first interview, he's first finding out what happened to his kids and is trying to come to terms with that, then given some time. And you talk about the 180. Let me just throw this out here as well, because in one of the initial phone calls with his wife, I mean, it appears to be that it's between Kevin and Ruby. This is from September 1st, 2023, 2 days after her arrest. Listen to what Kevin said.
I am committed to our family. I'm committed to you and our marriage, no matter what happens.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will be here to support you in any way that I can.
Well, thank you for stepping up.
And we know, Shelby, that he is now filed for divorce. And so things have changed. Your thoughts?
I think back to sentencing day, something that viewers and listeners may not have seen. I was inside the courtroom when Ruby was giving her very long statement. And she particularly began to break down emotionally when she was talking about her marriage to Kevin. And in that moment, he was very stoic. And Chad and Sherry were staring straight ahead. They were very stoic throughout the whole thing. And Kevin crumpled. He leaned forward and he had his head in his hands and he was sobbing when he was when Ruby was talking about their marriage and how it had fallen apart. Benefit of the doubt. Maybe it took him a couple of weeks to come out of that fog and realize what had happened and how connections had influenced their relationship. But clearly, this is a broken family. Even though the sentencing is over and both women are in prison, it's going to take a really long time for this family to pick up the pieces. Our understanding is that he's made amends with his oldest children. They've been seen together at several court appearances, and there's progress there. But as far as his relationship, I believe they were married more than 20 years. And in the YouTube videos, we saw a very happy, healthy, very open, vulnerable relationship between Ruby and Franke. And so for it all to dissolve like this is sad. And this family is broken because of what happened.
Have Kevin or his attorney released a statement or any word reacting to what was released last week?
I'm not aware of any statement in response to what was released last week. I know that Kevin's attorney was interviewed in ABC News' special on the evidence release, but he was repeating essentially what we've already been told already about Kevin's role in all of this, and that he has never been accused of any particular crime, and he was cooperative with investigators, and Washington County Attorney's Office will not be pursuing any charges against Kevin. And that's where things have been left so far. And Kevin, our understanding is that he's continuing to fight for custody of those children.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because even in his initial interview, they made clear that you can't leave yet, but you're not a suspect. You're not arrested. You're not charged with anything. And even though this is the first time we are seeing this information, investigators have had this for quite some time. So I don't expect that charges or anything like that, or there's an investigation that's going to happen or start right now. If there was an investigation or charges, it might have already happened. And again, there's been no evidence to suggest that Kevin knew about what happened to his kids in any which way. It seems to me that when you watch those videos, people could have questions, people could have criticisms, but there is no evidence to suggest he really knew what was happening and was somehow not telling the truth to law enforcement. When we first interviewed Randy Kester, I asked him, how is it possible a father wouldn't know what's happening to his kids, wouldn't know what's happening to his wife for over a year? But when you listen to those videos, I have a better understanding.
Mm-hmm. He says something that's so interesting in that first interview, the day that Ruby and Jody were arrested. He says, my role was to financially provide for the family, pay the bills, period. And my wife's role was to meet my kids' physical needs, and I trusted her with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are raising their eyebrows at that arrangement, but it's the arrangement they had. And he says that he was just there, again, to financially support the family. When they stopped the 8 Passengers channel, they lost a lot of their income. And so he was picking it back up. But we know, we've had it confirmed that he no longer has a job at Brigham Young University, where he was a college professor. So things have radically changed in Kevin's world.
Do we know where he's working and also what is next for him in this process? You mentioned trying to get custody of the children. He's in the middle of a divorce proceeding with his wife. So do you know where he's working and what is next for him?
I don't know where Kevin is working. I know that I've actually reached out to him previously for something completely unrelated. He's a professional and a keen expert in the area of geology. That's what he was working on at BYU. And so I don't know where he is working currently. We do know that he's trying to pursue custody of his children. Those court proceedings have been made private, so we aren't following those. Media's doesn't have access to those. But it would be difficult to have something this high profile. The world is talking about your family and seeing this evidence and seeing some very interviews where you're bearing your deepest, darkest secrets, perhaps, and it's been made public. And so I imagine there's a long road of recovery ahead for him. Something that I've always thought about in the back of my mind is Randy Kester told me that Kevin does want to speak when the time is right. And I'm wondering when that time is. because only he can decide when the time is right for him. But he says he wants to share his truth when he feels it's the right time. So perhaps we'll hear from him in his own words.
And I believe one of the last things that I had checked was that he was making efforts to have Jody Hildebrand pay for the costs of his children's medical care, because they have to ultimately recover mostly emotionally and mentally from what happened to them, and he shouldn't bear the brunt of the cost. It should actually be Jody Hildebrand. But my understanding, Shelby, is also he is trying to advocate now in Utah law for there to be a change in the law, right?
He is. We currently in the state of Utah do not have any regulations around life coaching. So you could be anyone, call yourself a life coach, sell services, and there are no rules you have to follow. There's no certification you have to have. You don't even need any credentials. He wrote a very long letter to a Senate committee that was read aloud in February during a committee meeting. And in it, he said, I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm busy tending to one of my children who is suffering from serious injuries, both mental and physical. That was quite an opening line.
Yeah.
But the senator who was the bill sponsor read this entire letter. And in it, Kevin says, my wife fell victim to a woman who called herself a life coach. And we know that Jody Hildebrand actually was formally licensed in the state of Utah. But as far as the connections thing, Kevin says that Ruby paid Jody $10,000 to get this certification of mental wellness trainer, a similar title to that. But Ruby didn't have any training. Ruby had a high school education, and then she was a stay-at-home mother. She doesn't have any mental health training that we have any record of. And he says her and dozens of other people have gone through these courses, sent their money to someone who is not preparing them and giving them life advice that is not healthy and doesn't meet any sort of mental health wellness standard. So he is advocating for this bill to create regulations around life coaching in the state of Utah. And it did not pass the session, but I went to Utah's Division of Professional Licensing, and they're the ones who determine if someone has a license or not. And they said their summer homework is to nail down the specifics of this bill and come forward next January in the next legislative session in Utah and get this passed. And they want to have specific regulations so that people don't fall victim to the Jody Hildebrands of the world.
Yeah, it's a very noble effort, and not surprisingly that he is advocating for this. Shelby Lofton, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure this is not the last that we're going to hear about this case. Would love to stay in contact as it progresses.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, everybody, that is all we have for you right now here on this episode of Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.